U.S. wheat buyers are pulling back while Canada is selling more grain into markets America used to count on. And if your food prices, your farm income, or your country's trade power depends on stable grain markets, this is not just a farming story. Because the big question is not whether America had one bad export week. The real question is whether buyers are starting to trust Canada more than the United States when food security is on the line. Before we go deeper, if you want clear, no-nonsense coverage of the political and economic stories shaping the US, Canada, and the world, subscribe to the channel. Now let's be very careful here because this story can be exaggerated if it is told the wrong way. The headline version is simple. US wheat exports had a rough week. Canada is gaining buyers, and global grain customers are becoming more selective. But the deeper version is much more serious. This is about trust. This is about price. This is about food safety rules. This is about trade wars. And this is about what happens when countries that buy food decide they do not want to rely too heavily on one supplier anymore. For the week ending May 22, 2025, U.S. wheat export sales for the old crop year reportedly went negative by 128,800 metric tons. In plain English, that means cancellations and reductions were bigger than new confirmed sales for that period. ProFarmer, citing USDA export sales data, reported net sales reductions of 128,800 metric tons for 2024 to 25 wheat, while new crop sales for 2025 to 26 were much stronger at 711,400 metric tons. That second part matters, because if someone tells you nobody wants American wheat anymore, that is too simple. The data does not prove that. What it does show is a warning sign. 1 week of negative old crop sales does not mean the entire U.S. wheat export system has collapsed. But when that week comes during a period of trade tension, low crop profitability, tougher buyer standards, and rising competition from Canada, Russia, Australia, and others, that becomes part of a much bigger pattern, and that pattern is what American farmers should be watching, because wheat is not just another crop. Wheat is bread. Wheat is pasta. Wheat is flour. Wheat is food security. Wheat is also influence. When a country sells grain to the world, it is not just moving bags of flour across an ocean. It is building relationships. It is giving importing countries confidence that when prices rise or politics get ugly, the food will still arrive. That is why this matters in Washington. That is why this matters in Ottawa. And that is why this matters in Manila, Seoul, Mexico City, Dhaka, Beijing, and every country that has to feed millions of people without growing enough wheat at home. The competitor's claim is that buyers, including the Philippines, South Korea, Mexico, and China, pulled back from U.S. wheat, while Canada moved into the gap. Some of that needs caution. We do not have enough public proof from the summary alone to say all those countries are broadly rejecting U.S. wheat. That word is too strong unless regulators or buyers confirm it across multiple shipments. But we do have enough evidence to say something real is happening. U.S. wheat is under pressure. Canada is expanding, and global buyers are shopping with more options, more rules, and less patience. Start with the U.S. side. America has been one of the most important wheat exporters in the world for decades. The Great Plains are part of the national identity. Kansas wheat, North Dakota spring wheat, Pacific Northwest soft white wheat. These are not just commodities. They are part of the American farm economy. But that economy has been shrinking. USDA's Economic Research Service says that since U.S. wheat planted area peaked in 1981, planted acreage has fallen by 43 million acres, and production has dropped by about 800 million bushels. USDA also notes that wheat ranks third among U.S. field crops behind corn and soybeans. That is a massive long-term change. And it did not happen because Americans stopped eating bread. It happened because farmers follow incentives. Corn and soybeans often offer better returns. Wheat prices have been weak. Input costs have been high. Weather has been difficult. Global competition has been brutal. Reuters reported in 2025 that wheat farmers in the Great Plains were facing low prices, climate pressure, field abandonment, and competition from more profitable crops like corn and soybeans. So when people talk about a sudden U.S. wheat problem, remember this. The foundation was already cracking. A bad export week did not create the problem. It exposed it. Now look at Canada. Canada has a different story right now. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada reported that for 2025 to 26, Canadian wheat production excluding durum rose 11% to 32.8 million metric tons, helped by stronger yields. The same report said Canadian wheat exports were running ahead of the previous year by about 5% crop year to date, while noting that whether the trend would last after Argentina and Australia finished their harvest was still uncertain. That last sentence is important. Even Canadian officials are not saying this is guaranteed forever. They are saying Canada has a stronger crop, better supply, and a current export advantage, but global wheat trade can shift fast. Cereals Canada also described the 2025 crop as strong quality, with Canada growing nearly 40 million tons of wheat overall and expecting to export 27.7 million tons to more than 80 countries in the 2025 to 26 crop year. So Canada is not just benefiting from U.S. weakness. Canada has supply, Canada has quality, Canada has a reputation, and in food trade, reputation can be worth as much as price. That brings us to Bangladesh. Bangladesh is one of the clearest examples in the story. Reports said Bangladesh became Canada's largest wheat customer in the first quarter of the 2025 to 26 crop year, buying 546,900 tons, nearly 10 times the prior year's volume. Analysts cited Canadian wheat quality and low global prices as key reasons, while also warning that demand could ease when Australian supplies entered the market. That is not a small shift. Going from 56,200 tons to 546,900 tons is not just a rounding error. That is a buyer changing behavior. And when a buyer changes behavior once, other exporters notice. Russia notices. Australia notices. Argentina notices. The European Union notices. Canada notices. And American wheat groups notice too. But here is where the story gets tricky. Did Bangladesh buy more Canadian wheat because it was angry at the United States? Maybe not. Did it buy more Canadian wheat because Canadian quality looked good and prices were attractive? Very possibly. Did it buy more because Canada had more supply to move? Yes, that is consistent with the broader data. So the cleanest reading is this: Canada did not magically steal the market overnight. Canada had the right crop at the right time with the right quality image, while buyers were already looking for alternatives. That is how market share moves. Not always with one dramatic announcement. Sometimes it moves quietly. One contract, then another. Then a buyer tests a supplier. Then the supplier performs. Then the buyer comes back. And by the time politicians notice, the trade relationship has already shifted. Now let's talk about why buyers may be pulling back from U.S. wheat in certain markets. The summary gives three main pressures: food safety and regulatory standards, cheaper Russian wheat, and trade war retaliation. Each one matters, but each one needs to be handled honestly. First, food safety and regulatory standards. Many countries are tightening how they look at pesticide residues, biotechnology, and import tolerances. This does not automatically mean U.S. wheat is unsafe. It means the rules around food imports are becoming more political, more technical, and more strict. The European Union, for example, has been moving towards stricter pesticide residue rules for imported agricultural products. USDA reporting on EU proposals said the European Commission sought to set residue levels for certain non-EU approved pesticides at the limit of quantification, effectively near zero. That does not prove that U.S. wheat shipments were rejected in 2025 because of residues. Let's be clear, but it does show the direction of travel. Importing countries are using food rules as trade rules. And once that starts, exporters must prove not only that their product is affordable, but that it fits the buyer's political and regulatory environment. This is where Canada has an advantage in perception. Canada often markets its wheat as premium, clean, consistent, and reliable. That does not mean U.S. wheat is bad. It means Canada has a brand that works well when buyers are nervous. And nervous buyers are everywhere right now. They are nervous about war. They are nervous about tariffs. They are nervous about climate. They are nervous about shipping routes. They are nervous about domestic food inflation. And they are nervous about being trapped inside another country's political fight. Second, Russian wheat. This is one of the biggest pressures on U.S. wheat. Russia has become a massive force in global wheat exports. When Russian wheat is cheap, buyers listen. Countries that need to feed large populations cannot always pay a premium for political friendship. A miller in Asia or North Africa may like American wheat quality. A government buyer may respect U.S. reliability. But if Russian wheat lands cheaper and the shipment can arrive on time, that price difference becomes hard to ignore. That is especially true when governments are trying to control bread prices. Bread is political. In many countries, bread prices can shape public anger. So when wheat gets expensive, leaders do not think like grain traders. They think like politicians. They ask, where can we get the wheat cheaper? And if the answer is Russia, Canada, Australia, Argentina, or the EU, then the United States has to compete harder. Third, trade war retaliation. This is the most political part of the story. The United States has used tariffs as leverage. China has responded to U.S. tariffs with tariffs and restrictions of its own. AP reported in March 2025 that China imposed additional tariffs of up to 15% on major U.S. farm exports in response to U.S. tariff actions. For American farmers, that is not theory, that hits the farm gate. When Washington gets into a trade fight, agriculture often becomes the target. Why? Because rival governments know farm states matter politically. They know soybeans matter. They know wheat matters. They know pork, beef, corn, and canola matter. They know rural pressure can become political pressure. So when China, Mexico, Canada, or another country wants to answer Washington, they can aim at U.S. agriculture. And that is why this wheat story is bigger than one commodity. It shows how trade fights move through real people. A tariff battle in Washington can become a canceled shipment in the grain market. A canceled shipment can become a lower cash price for farmers. A lower cash price can change what gets planted next year, and over time that changes the map of global food power. Now, the competitor summary includes a claim that China canceled more than 500,000 tons of scheduled U.S. wheat shipments. That is a serious claim, but based on the information available here, it should be treated carefully unless confirmed by official export sales data or direct buyer reporting. China has a long history of using agricultural purchases as a political tool. It can buy heavily when relations improve. It can slow purchases when relations worsen. It can shift toward Brazil, Russia, Australia, Canada, or domestic reserves when it wants leverage. So the claim fits the pattern of trade politics. But fitting a pattern is not the same as confirmed fact. That distinction matters. Because if we want credibility, we cannot turn every market rumor into a headline. What we can say is this: in a world where China and the United States are locked in repeated tariff fights, American agriculture carries political risk that competitors can exploit. And Canada is one of those competitors. Now, for Canadian viewers, this might sound like good news: more wheat sales, more export demand, more global market share, more respect for Canadian grain. And yes, there is a real upside here. If Canada can sell more wheat into Bangladesh, the Philippines, Vietnam, and other growing markets, that helps farmers, grain handlers, rail networks, port terminals, and the broader agriculture economy. It also strengthens Canada's diplomatic position. Food supply is influence. When a country can help feed another country, it gains a relationship that is deeper than a press conference. That is why Canada's wheat story is not just about farmers in Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario. It is about national strategy. Canada often gets discussed through energy, critical minerals, defense spending, or its relationship with the United States. But food is also power. And in a world of climate shocks, wars, shipping disruptions, and trade fights, a reliable food exporter becomes more important. This gives Canada an opening, but it also creates pressure. Because global buyers do not reward a country forever just because one crop year was strong. Canada has to deliver. It has to move grain efficiently. It has to keep rail and port systems reliable. It has to manage labor issues, weather risk, infrastructure limits, and quality control. It has to prove that the Canadian advantage is not just a good harvest, but a dependable system. That is the real test. Because if a buyer in Bangladesh or Southeast Asia switches to Canadian wheat and has a good experience, that buyer may come back. But if shipment delays pile up, if prices jump, if quality varies, or if another supplier undercuts Canada, the buyer can move again. Grain loyalty is real, but it is not blind. Now, for American viewers, this story should hit differently, because this is not just about losing a few export contracts. It is about the slow erosion of a farm sector that already feels ignored. Think about the farmer who has watched wheat lose ground to corn and soybeans for years. Think about the elevator operator who depends on volume. Think about the rail lines and terminals built around export flows. Think about rural towns where every crop decision affects equipment dealers, mechanics, lenders, seed suppliers, truckers, and families. When export demand weakens, it does not stay on a spreadsheet. It reaches Main Street. And the painful part is that some of this is outside the farmer's control. A farmer cannot control Washington's tariff strategy. A farmer cannot control China's retaliation. A farmer cannot control Russian export pricing. A farmer cannot control another country's residue rules. A farmer cannot control currency moves, ocean freight, or diplomatic tension. But the farmer takes the hit. That is why using agriculture as a trade war weapon is so dangerous. Politicians may call tariffs leverage. Farmers may call them lost customers. And once a customer leaves, getting that customer back is not easy, because grain buyers hate uncertainty. They may tolerate a higher price if they trust the supplier. They may tolerate a longer route if the supplier is reliable. But what they do not want is political whiplash. They do not want to wake up and wonder whether a new tariff, new inspection rule, new sanction, or new diplomatic fight will disrupt food supply. That is where Canada's quieter image helps. Canada is not free from trade conflict. Canada has its own disputes, including with China over canola and other products. But in wheat, Canada can present itself as stable, rules-based, quality-focused, and less politically chaotic than Washington. That image can matter in boardrooms and government purchasing offices. Do you think this is smart competition from Canada, or is it a warning that U.S. trade policy is making American farmers easier to replace? Because that is the uncomfortable question. The United States may still have world-class wheat. It may still have reliable exporters. It may still have deep grain infrastructure. It may still be one of the most important agricultural powers on earth. But if buyers start to believe that American supply comes with political risk, then quality alone may not be enough. This is where the story becomes much bigger than wheat. For decades, the United States did not just export commodities, it exported confidence. The dollar, the Navy protecting sea lanes, the trade system, the idea that U.S. supply chains were deep, liquid, and dependable. But in the last several years, buyers around the world have learned a hard lesson. The global system can change fast. A pandemic can shut ports. A war can block grain routes. A drought can wreck crops. A tariff can change costs overnight. A sanction can make a supplier radioactive. An election can rewrite trade policy. So countries are diversifying. They are not just asking who has wheat today. They are asking who can we trust tomorrow. That is the real shift. And Canada is trying to answer that question. Russia answers it with price and volume. Australia answers it with seasonal supply and quality. Argentina answers it when harvest and currency conditions line up. The European Union answers it in certain nearby markets. And the United States has to answer it too, not with slogans, with reliability, with trade stability, with competitive pricing, with clear regulatory standards, with a farm economy that still makes wheat worth planting. Because if American wheat acreage keeps shrinking, the export problem becomes harder. You can't sell what farmers no longer want to grow. You can't dominate a market if your planted acres keep falling. You can't maintain influence if your customers start building supply chains around someone else. This does not mean U.S. wheat is finished. Not even close. The United States still has major advantages. It has class diversity, hard red winter wheat, hard red spring wheat, soft red winter, soft white, durum. It has deep market institutions. It has experienced exporters. It has a reputation for transparent data. It has strong inspection systems. It has buyers that still want U.S. wheat for specific flour and baking needs. And as USDA data showed later in 2025, U.S. wheat exports for June through August were actually up 14% from the same period a year earlier, which is a major reason we should not treat one negative week as proof of total collapse. So the honest story is not America has lost wheat forever. The honest story is this: America has vulnerabilities, Canada has momentum, and global buyers are becoming less forgiving. That is still serious. Because markets do not need collapse to change. They only need a steady shift in preference. A few percentage points here. A buyer testing Canada there. A contract moving from the U.S. Gulf to Vancouver. A Southeast Asian miller deciding Canadian wheat gives better consistency. A government buyer choosing Russian wheat because it is cheaper. A Mexican importer diversifying because politics feel risky. A Chinese buyer slowing U.S. purchases during a tariff fight. Individually, each move can be explained. Together, they can become a trend. Now let's talk about Mexico. Mexico is one of the most important agricultural customers for the United States. It is close. It is connected by rail and road. It is part of the North American food system. So any claim that Mexico reduced American wheat imports by 40% needs careful checking. If true, that would be a major warning. But without direct official data in the summary, we should treat the exact number as a claim, not a confirmed conclusion. Still, the broader risk is real. Mexico and the United States have already fought over agricultural biotechnology, especially genetically modified corn. Reuters reported in 2025 that Mexico's lower house approved a constitutional reform banning the planting of genetically modified corn after a USMCA dispute over Mexico's previous restrictions on GM corn imports. That dispute was about corn, not wheat. But it shows something important. Food trade between allies is no longer simple. Even under USMCA, politics can enter the grain market. Public health arguments, national identity arguments, environmental arguments, farmer protection arguments, and sovereignty arguments can all become trade issues. So when wheat buyers look at the United States, they do not only look at protein levels and freight rates, they look at the political environment around American agriculture. That matters. For Canada, Mexico is also a reminder being an alternative supplier is valuable. But North American trade is deeply connected. Canada cannot simply celebrate U.S. difficulty as if it lives on another planet. Canada's economy is tied to the United States. Canadian farmers sell into the same global markets. Canadian exporters face the same freight challenges. Canadian trade can also be hit by retaliation. So the smarter Canadian position is not, America's losing, Canada wins. The smarter position is global buyers are diversifying, and Canada must prove it can be the reliable premium option. That is a more durable strategy. Now look at Asia. The Philippines, South Korea, Vietnam, and Bangladesh are exactly the kinds of markets grain exporters want. Population growth, urbanization, rising food demand, changing diets, more bakery products, more noodles, more processed foods, more need for stable imports. These countries do not want drama. They want supply. They want quality. They want predictable terms. And they want choices. If Canada can increase sales into these markets, it is not just selling wheat. It is building future demand. But again, the buyer is not emotional. The buyer is practical. If Canadian wheat fits the flour mill, arrives on time, clears regulations, and competes on price, Canada gains. If U.S. wheat becomes cheaper, cleaner in the buyer's eyes, or more politically secure, the U.S. can regain ground. If Russia undercuts everyone, Russia gains. This is a knife fight in slow motion. Not loud, not always visible, but very real. And there is another layer here, food security diplomacy. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the world learned how fragile grain trade can be. Ukraine is a major grain exporter. War can turn wheat into a weapon without a single shot being fired at a buyer. Now the question is, who benefits? Canada benefits if it can keep quality high and logistics strong. Canadian farmers benefit if export demand supports prices. Canadian grain companies benefit if more volume moves through ports. Countries like Bangladesh may benefit if they can diversify supply and secure better prices. Russia benefits if trade politics make U.S. wheat less attractive and buyers become more price sensitive. Other exporters benefit when U.S. policy uncertainty pushes buyers to compare alternatives. Who loses? American wheat farmers lose if export demand weakens and prices stay low. Rural communities lose if wheat keeps shrinking. U.S. trade influence loses if buyers see America as less reliable. Consumers can eventually lose if global grain politics raise food costs or create supply shocks. And governments lose flexibility if food becomes another battlefield in trade wars. That is why this story is not just about one grain. It is about the future of economic power. For years, energy got most of the attention: oil, gas, pipelines, LNG, critical minerals. But food is now part of national security again, not in a symbolic way, in a very practical way. If a country cannot feed its people, politics can become unstable fast. If a government cannot control bread prices, anger can spread fast. If a country depends on a hostile supplier, it becomes vulnerable. So wheat is not boring. Wheat is strategic. And right now, Canada is trying to look like the steady supplier, while the U.S. wrestles with political risk and long-term acreage decline. But the final answer is not simple. This is not a clean story where Canada is perfect and America is failing. Canada has weather risk. Canada has rail risk. Canada has port risk. Canada has trade risk. Canada has its own tensions with China. Canada also has to compete with low-cost suppliers. And the United States, despite its problems, still has enormous capacity and a long record of serving global buyers. So the better question is not, is U.S. wheat dead? It is, how much market trust can the U.S. afford to lose before buyers permanently change their habits? That is the question Washington should be asking. Because farmers can survive a bad week, they can survive a bad season, they can survive price cycles. What is harder to survive is a slow reputation shift, a buyer who quietly moves on, a market that stops calling first, a miller that rebuilds its blend around Canadian wheat, a government buyer that signs a longer-term arrangement with another supplier, a country that decides American food supply is too exposed to American politics. That is the danger. And it does not arrive with sirens. It arrives through contracts. Now here is what could happen next. If U.S. wheat prices become more competitive, some buyers may return quickly. If the U.S. wheat prices become more competitive, some buyers may return quickly. Dollar weakens. American wheat can become more attractive. If Russian supply tightens, importers may look back to North America. If Canada faces logistics problems or a weaker crop next year, its advantage could narrow. If trade tensions ease, political risk around U.S. agriculture could fall. But if tariffs keep escalating, if buyers keep tightening standards, if U.S. acreage keeps falling, and if Canada keeps delivering quality into growing markets, then this shift becomes harder to dismiss. It becomes structural. And structural change is the kind that policymakers usually recognize too late. Is this about national security, economics, or election politics? The answer is yes. It is all three. For the United States, wheat exports are farm income, rural politics, and global influence. For Canada, wheat exports are economic opportunity, national branding, and food diplomacy. For buyers, wheat is survival, price control, and supply security. And for the world, wheat is one more reminder that the old trade system is being rebuilt in real time. The countries that can produce reliably, ship reliably, and stay politically dependable will gain power. The countries that create too much uncertainty will lose leverage. That is the real story behind the numbers. Not just 128,800 metric tons. Not just Bangladesh buying more Canadian wheat. Not just acreage falling since 1981. Those are the signals. The deeper message is that food buyers are becoming more strategic. They are not waiting for the next crisis. They are preparing before it arrives. And if America wants to keep its role as a global grain power, it cannot assume buyers will stay loyal forever. Trust has to be earned shipment by shipment. Canada understands that. Russia understands that. Australia understands that. And now the United States has to decide whether wheat is just another crop or whether it is still part of American power.